James stood as still as he could. As he leaned inside of the doorframe, his mechanical hand raised and steadily holding his phone, the artificial muscles making very sure not to shake it or move it around too much, as he observed the scene unfolding before him, while the device recorded the whole thing. Sheeda sat on the side of his old bed, her feet lazily hanging off its side, while her hands pressed into the mattress on either side of her body. However, while her posture itself looked mostly relaxed, the rest of her behaviour made a slightly different impression. Her ears were attentively turned forwards, widening into an almost rounded shape while they concentrated on the area right before her. Her eyes were laser-focused downwards, with her pupils slightly constricted, and as far as James could tell, she hadn't blinked in at least a minute. While most of her body was almost entirely motionless, the exception was formed by her tail, which was sweeping across the mattress from left to right in quick yet even intervals, creating a slight dragging and crinkling sound as it pulled the sheets along with its movement. Meanwhile, her breathing had become slow and gradual, making it nearly undetectable to James, if he didn't specifically focus on it. And on the ground in front of her, on all fours, stood the subject of her seemingly intense focus. Ears similarly standing and tail similarly swaying, standing strong while clocking in at an impressive 1/15 of her opponent's weight, stood Spinach, the dark grey house cat. A German Rex, to be precise. The much smaller feline moved hesitantly while facing off with this stranger that had been brought into her home, slowly inching ever closer towards that strange being that had been brought before her there. If he was being honest, James did slightly wonder if the cat even realised that there was a difference between the off-worlder in front of her and the usual clumsy bipedal giant she had to deal with on a daily basis. The claim that house cats perceive all beings they are socialised with as other, very weird cats, floated around in his mind, although he couldn't quite remember if that was more fact or oid in this case. Either way, he stayed out of this, quietly watching and holding the camera as whatever would happen, happened. Well, technically he also did block the door. After a certain surge of excitement that had happened earlier, when the resident felines were unleashed from their washroom prison, Sheeda had signalled to him that she had had enough socialising for a day, and that the stress of everyone's eyes being vehemently on her while this strange first introduction was made was not something that she would be willing to deal with right now, which is why the two of them had resigned into James's domain, taking only one of the 4 eager felines that populated the house with them. Of course, James had very purposely picked the most social and docile one. Sheeda had, however, agreed to letting the process be recorded for everyone else, which was why her boyfriend was now playing cameraman. And so far, it was going good. At least there hadn't been any hissing or shrieking yet. By now, the little grey ball of fur had managed to inch forward to the point where she was almost at Sheeda's feet. All the while, Sheeda's eyes had never left the smaller feline, causing her to thus lean almost entirely forward now, while she stared it down. Taking one last tentative step in the bigger cat's direction, Spinach began to sniff at the air close to Sheeda's legs, holding completely still for a second while taking in the scent. After a moment of sniffing, the smaller cat briefly recoiled back, as if the scent had directly scared her somehow. Her body pulled back slightly, and her ears folded back into a more apprehensive position, while her leading paw remained in the air, unmoving. That first little scare, however, didn't keep her in place long. Soon the waving of her tail became slightly more intense, as she once again pushed her body forwards, her paw raising slightly higher in the air, as her face approached the scary legs once again. A few times, Spinach's body bobbed back and forth, as if the cat was unsure of her next action, and constantly stopped herself to reconsider. Even as she raised her paw even higher, did she let it drop down again silently a couple of times. However, after a few more moments, the feline gathered her resolve, put all of her seemingly endless courage into her next move, leaned forwards, and completely harmlessly batted against Sheeda's foot in a clawless strike, before immediately pulling back in fright again, despite the complete and utter lack of reaction from Sheeda's side. A human would have probably at least moved their foot or said something, or would have had the slightest reaction otherwise, but not the Meat. No, she just sat there and kept up her focus, almost as if she was daring that tiny thing in front of her to try its next move and see if it was any more effective. After the first batting had not ended in retaliation or retreat of her opponent, Spinach seemed to relax slightly again. Her tail didn't move quite so erratic anymore, and her ears also turned forwards, facing again. Now almost leisurely, the grey Furber walked completely over to Sheeda and began to rub her head alongside the larger feline's leg. To James, this would have usually been a sign that the interaction had gone well. However, to his surprise, Sheeda's reaction to what his brain understood as a probable gesture of affection was much stronger than it had been to the probative attack. It wasn't a kick by any stretch of the imagination. The movement was way too slow and soft to be regarded as intending any sort of harm. Still, admittedly, James's heart almost skipped an appalled beat as she witnessed how Sheeda quickly shook her leg, interrupting the gentle head rub of Spinach, and pushing the cat away from her in one movement. Additionally, the big feline released a displeased sound that sounded a lot more honestly annoyed than James would have ever expected from such an innocuous thing, and Spinach seemed to quickly get the hint. With quick, springy leaps, the cat made a tactical retreat from Sheeda, bouncing away from the bed and towards the corner of the room, where a large cat tree stood, into which Spinach quickly retreated, hiding away in one of the many small holes made to be climbed through or laid in. James had quickly followed the retreating feline with the camera's lens, and was now waiting a few seconds. However, it seemed that Spinach had had enough for the moment, and not wanting to force any stress onto the pet, James decided to call it good there, turning the recording off. "You know, she was trying to welcome you," he then explained, while putting his phone away, his eyes turning back towards his girlfriend who, now that the standoff was over, had relaxed her body language and leaned back onto her hands. "She was wiping something off on me," Sheeda countered, and briefly lifted her leg up to look at the one spot Spinach had managed to rub against before being chased away. "Yeah, she was trying to mark you as welcome," James replied, and reached up to his face to point at his cheeks. "They have these scent glands that, well, anyway, they rub like that on stuff they like." "Scent glands?" Sheeda asked, and briefly rubbed her fingers along her own cheek, almost as if she needed to check if she had something like that, and just never noticed it before. However, after a contemplative glance, she quickly shook her head and put her hand back down. "Well, I don't want to be marked either. I'm not going to be claimed that easily." She threw an almost spiteful look over at the cat tree that was now hiding the tinier cat somewhere inside of it. James sighed. "It's not," he started, but just as quickly decided to give it up. This wasn't a topic for just before bed. While he was busy letting go of the topic, a shudder visibly went through Sheeda's body, and she leaned forward so her hands were free to reach up and rub along her shoulders in a visual attempt to warm herself. At this point, she had dropped most of the layers of winter clothes she had previously worn, instead slipping the knitted pyjamas with tiger stripe patterns that she had gotten as a present back on the Salem, and seemingly the room's mild temperature began to catch up with her. "You humans and your damn cold," she mumbled, while pulling her feet up to also huddle them against her body, before she scooted to the side, closer to the wall, thus creating a lot of free space on the bed next to her. "Oh no," she said, now clearly addressing him instead of just murmuring to herself. "Looks like your kitten doesn't like me. Too bad. Can we lie down now? I'm freezing here." "It's 21 degrees, you're fine," James laughingly assured her. However, he still complied with her request, scooting up next to her into bed and pulling up the blanket so she could start heating up again. Quickly, she sprawled out next to him, making sure her limbs took up as much real estate on his heat-radiating body as they possibly could, while she began to softly purr. "There's a sauna in the basement," James informed her quietly, while also making himself comfortable to the best of his ability. "If you really need to warm up, you can have a go at that in the morning." "A sauna?" Sheeda asked, although she sounded more mildly than genuinely curious. Quickly, James tried to think of a more general term to use. Hot room?" he blurted out, as it was the only idea that came to his mind for it at the time. Sheeda giggled slightly, as his usually sharp words failed him. "Maybe I'll try it," she mumbled and nuzzled up to him, and the way in which she said it had a sort of "and now shut up" message to it. maybe she was a lot more tired than she let on. Miat did need more sleep and general rest than humans, after all. And so, James didn't want to bother her further, and simply closed his eyes, beginning the usually long wait for sleep to come. At some point in the night, he was briefly woken up as he felt a small weight walking across him. The careful paws stayed far away from the wall side of the bed, before a small body curled up somewhere to the right of his head. Although he barely was aware during what could hardly be called an interaction, it did put a smile on his face as he drifted off again. And this time, he remained undisturbed until he naturally awoke to the darkness of an early winter morning. Although she obviously could have slept for a much longer time by herself, Sheeta was soon also woken up by his stirring, and she tidily blinked up at him as he began to remove her arms and legs from his body so he could get up. "What time is it?" she asked, fruitlessly glancing around for any sort of clock, while James gently slipped out from underneath the covers. Pressing them down again after he had gotten out, he leaned in towards her and pressed a kiss onto her forehead. "Sleepy time for you," he whispered, and put a hand onto her shoulder, encouraging her to fully lie back down. "I'm going ahead and making breakfast. Do you want anything specific?" Sheeta yielded to his gentle force, and plopped fully back into the pillows as she turned her head away slightly. "Rice-cooked broth," she mumbled into the sheets. "I need something to warm up." Soon after, she already seemed to be slipping off again. James stood up straight and stemmed his hands into his hips. Well, that could be an issue. Hopefully there will be a recipe for the traditional Miat drink somewhere online to find. As he turned toward the door to go about his morning routine, before starting the early endeavour, the soft thump of something light jumping to the floor behind him could be heard, before a tiny form began to eagerly try to rub against his legs as he walked, nearly tripping him as she did so. "Spinach," he quietly whispered in slight displeasure. "I'm trying to walk here." A good bit of time later, he stood in the kitchen working away at the stove with his phone in hand once again. Luckily, rice-cooked broth, much like many if not all Miat delicacies it seemed, was fairly easy to prepare. Although, while the name was indeed quite literal, it also wasn't as easy as really just cooking a broth 3 times. You started it with some animal fat of any kind, heating it in a pot until it melted. Into that you then threw, as the recipe specified, any sort of meat scraps and other leftovers you have lying around. Although if you felt generous or fancy, you could apparently also use fresher meat and animal parts, which was what James opted for. You gave it a good sear until it turned very brown, and started to leak juices, and then you covered it in water depending on how much meat you had. When translated, the recipe called for about 200 milliliters of water for every 100 grams of substance, and it highly recommended cooking big batches at a time and storing much of it for later, mostly because the recipe called for such a long preparation. This certainly wasn't just making your morning coffee, because each cooking step was clocked in at half of a uniform hour, at the very least. So, after leaving it to simmer for a while, you then strained the broth into a separate container, ideally filtering it to make sure you got every scrap of meat or bone out of there. Putting the container aside for the time being, you were then supposed to take out your scissors, which are apparently a very commonly used instrument in Miat cooking, and started separating the already seared meat, bone, and whatever else into rough parts, revealing the yet untouched insides. With the thusly generated rough pieces, you then repeated the first step of searing them, getting them all brown and juicing again, before adding the broth back to it and leaving it to cook for at least another half an hour, while also scraping up all that good stuff from the bottom. The third step was then basically more of the same. Strain, filter, hack apart and sear. Although only now you were supposed to also add a generous pinch of salt, intended to make the now even smaller pieces of meat give up even the last of their juices. Also, if you were feeling fancy, this was the step where you could additionally add some high-quality marrow in order to refine your broth. Well, luckily, they did have some cloned marrow around, even if it was usually intended for animal food. It was still high quality though. In with it. Then add the broth back, cook it one last time, and voila! You had the meatiest water you ever tasted. Admittedly, James still remembered the taste of the Miat staple quite well from his stay on Dunama, and therefore he forewent any taste testing during the cooking, mostly because his own opinion would help very little anyway. While he was beginning to sear the marrow, salt, and shredded meat scraps for the third step, he heard the hollow sound of footsteps slowly stepping down the wooden stairs over in the living room, turning his head to see who was coming there. A very tired Coco, wrapped in a bathrobe from the collar of which a green t-shirt peeked out, slowly skulked her way over, moving as if she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Looking at him being already hard at work, she blinked slowly as she leaned over the small wall separating kitchen from living room. "Is coffee ready?" she asked, likely figuring he might have already prepared some while cooking away, and her eyes only briefly twitched down to the massacre of meat he was preparing there. However, James hadn't felt the need for it today, so he had to shake his head. "I'll put some on in a minute," he then promised, as he reached over to pour the previously prepared broth into the pot for the final cooking step. Then he quickly gazed back up as she started to walk down the hall leading to his and Flynn's rooms, calling after her, "Where are you going?" "Bath upstairs occupied," her voice came back from the hall, shortly before a door could be heard opening and closing. Nodding to himself, James got back to work. Now that the broth was cooking for the last time, he had time to prepare stuff for the human side of the breakfast, as well as some easier stuff for Sheeda. Once again, the fact that they had to feed so many animals came in handy. What other household on Earth would already have sausages made from entire animals, and not just the meat lying around? Well, entire animals in the way that they contain parts from an animal's entire body, even though in this case they had all been cloned and assembled separately after the fact. That helped better control what actually went into it, and therefore what the animals were actually eating. It also highly increased the quality, so that he had no quarrels with serving it up to his girlfriend, even if it was technically animal food. He'd certainly have no quarrel eating it if his stomach was made for it. For the human side, he also prepared some sausages, along with fresh eggs, which weren't cloned, since the egg substitutes in his opinion were all but great, and some bacon, although most of them likely wouldn't be eating anything warm in the morning. One task after another slowly became fulfilled, and at some point Jim realised that the coffee had been finished for a while now, yet there was no sign of Coco anywhere. He hadn't really been paying attention while he worked, so if he had not noticed if the door had sounded again or not. However, since he didn't hear the shower running, he figured that she basically had to be done by now. Had he simply missed her going upstairs again? Not impossible, but unlikely. He hadn't been that distracted. Seeing as all these still cooking pots could take care of themselves for a few minutes, he decided to very briefly investigate. Stepping out of the kitchen and into the hall, he could immediately see that the bathroom, which lay straight ahead, was dark and unoccupied. There was, however, a bit of light coming from its sides, meaning that the lamps had been turned on in either of the private rooms down the hall. Following a hunch, he immediately walked over to his own door, and he had, of course, been correct. A tiny stretch of light leaked out from underneath the door to his own room. Carefully, he extended his hand to the handle and opened it, peeking inside. He was greeted by a rather bizarre sight. Coco had indeed gone to his room. Right now, she was laying flat on her back, and looked up with excited fascination, while her arms reached straight upwards so her hands could gently touch and caress the ears of Sheeda, who in turn sat leaned right over the commander, with her own hand sinking flatly, right into Coco's breasts. What the hell was it with him walking in on people now? Although, this time, it became clear very quickly that there was absolutely nothing sexual about the situation, when the both of them reacted to his coming in. Neither of them looked even so much as slightly embarrassed or caught in the act, as their excited gazes raised and they beamed up at him with big smiles, almost simultaneously announcing, "They're so soft!" James blinked twice, his brain briefly fighting with the onslaught of bizarre information. At least it seemed he wasn't being cheated on in his own bed, so... yay? Swallowing his first impulse to make some sort of snide remark, he simply replied, "Yes, I'm aware. thus answering both of their exclamations while he slightly chuckled. Then, lifting a hand and pointing in the direction of the kitchen, he added, "Breakfast is almost ready, if you want any." The women briefly exchanged a glance before pulling their hands away from each other and standing up, beginning to follow him out of the room. Briefly, he wondered if he should ask how exactly they had gotten into that situation, and if it had been going on for a while, or if his timing just really was that bad, but he figured either were going to tell him either way, or it really wasn't all that newsworthy. Leading the way into the kitchen dining room, James began to set the table, while advising Sheeta and Coco to go and get their respective hot beverages, although the both of them also soon began to help him with setting everything up, without needing to be asked to. Although, Sheeta paused for a moment after she had taken her first real sip of her hot drink, moving the cup about a hand's width away from her face, and eyeing the liquid inside almost suspiciously. "Is something wrong?" James asked her, as he carried a stack of cutting boards to the table and distributed them in front of the chairs. Sheeta hesitated for a moment before she answered, and took a very intense sniff of the broth's aroma. Then she mumbled, "Tastes expensive." James now also stopped for a second, and tilted his head to the side as he looked at her. "Is that good, bad, both, neither?" he asked, kind of antsy to get an opinion out of her. He was usually quite proud of his cooking skills, but that was when cooking for humans. Now a tiny bit of his pride was on the line, with the first time he had cooked for an off-worlder with a completely different palate. Sheeta exhaled through her nose. "It's good," she said, and took another long drink of the broth, her eyes turning suspicious again even as she did so. After swallowing, she added, "I just almost feel bad drinking this." Relieved by her approval, James now laughed heartily. "Well, you don't have to worry about that. High-quality ingredients have stopped being an issue around here a while ago," he reassured her, before getting back into his groove of carrying cutlery, cold cuts, and spreads back and forth. "Yeah, high quality," Sheeta mumbled with some serious sarcasm, her still not quite completely overcome disdain for artificially cloned meats coming through once again. However, she didn't complain any further than that. Meanwhile, all the commotion in the kitchen had seemingly spread through the house, and soon they could hear the third door down the hall open as well, before Flynn trudged into the living room, already wearing shirt and jeans and with his hands in his pockets. "Morning," he greeted everyone roughly while glancing around, his tired eyes seemingly taking stock of the situation. "What's with all the ruck—" He stopped dead as he got the full picture of the already cooked food and set table, and he stared at it, or almost flabbergasted for a moment. Then he looked up at James. "Did you cook?" he asked him, his voice sounding questioning but also a bit uneasy. "Kid, you didn't have to." James just confusedly tilted his head. "I've always made breakfast," he simply replied with a shrug, not quite getting why this would be surprising now. Maybe he hadn't stocked up for so many people. "If you're worried about your pantry, I'll go out and replace everything later. I might need to get some things anyway." As he spoke, he turned around to pour his uncle a cup of coffee, and now held it out to him with a smile. Flynn sighed and shook his head slowly, but still took the cup out of his hand. "No, it's fine," he mumbled, almost more to himself than to James. "Just didn't want to bother you, is all." James scowled even more than before. Bother him? They were the one invading Flynn's home here, not the other way around. However, James didn't quite get to comment on that, as he noticed something in his periphery. "I wouldn't recommend tasting that," he quickly said, speaking to both Sheeta and Coco, who had seemingly swapped their mugs for a moment, presumably to try what the other one was having. It would be an experience that neither of them enjoyed, James knew. Quickly walking over to her, he snatched the coffee mug out of Sheeta's hand as she tried to take a sip anyway. The taste would be one thing, but he did not want to have to deal with an upset feline stomach for the rest of their stay, so he would put a lid on the food stealing right now. Everyone eventually settled down at the table, and began to take whatever they fancied from the cornucopia of breakfast foods. James helpfully informed everyone which sausages were edible for humans, and which were probably better avoided. Sheeta frowned slightly, as she scanned over the available options. "So," she asked, after a moment of looking around, "is any of this not out of a factory or laboratory?" James looked at her, excusingly. "Well, the eggs are fresh," he informed her, and pointed at the white ovals that were stacked in a tiny basket. "Should be fine for your stomach, too." She'd looked at the basket interestedly for a moment, her ears twitching slightly as she inspected it. "I haven't had eggs in a while," she mumbled, as she reached for one. Meanwhile, Flynn was finishing a large sip of his coffee, and then leaned over the table towards her. "So, you're a fan of the natural stuff as well, huh? Do I have someone with finer taste under my roof yet?" he asked, almost facetiously, but looked quite serious as he gave Sheeta a once-over. James exhaled tiredly. "Turns out clone meat isn't really widely used in the galaxy. It seems the larger community has a fable for anything all-natural, and dislikes anything that deviates from that, so you don't really find clone stuff almost anywhere else," he informed his uncle, hoping that it wouldn't somehow break loose a discussion about the viability, ethics, prestige, and health ramifications of natural versus artificial meat. Flynn laughed hoarsely. "You're telling me they're feeding you the genuine stuff up there? Maybe I should think about retirement in space," he commented, and shook his head for a moment as if chasing the thought away. Then, he leaned towards Sheeta again. "Tell you what, right now we deal with the cloned meat, but tonight for dinner, I'll break open the stash and cook up some of the real stuff. What do you say?" Sheeta's yellow eyes twinkled for a second as she looked back at him. "Deal," she gave back with a predatory smirk. Then her eyes briefly wandered down, and she reached out a hand toward James's plate, trying to steal a piece of buttered bread for herself. However, James was quick to swat the grasper away. "Okay, you can't first complain about cloned meat and then try to steal plant-based stuff from my plate. One or the other, you can't have both," he warned her, with an annoyed side-eye. "I'm eating it," Sheeta whined back, shaking her swatted hand as if he had used who knows how much force to remove it, while using the other one to take a bite of sausage that disappeared down her throat almost as soon as she had taken it. The banter continued throughout the course of the breakfast. To Sheeta's disdain, it took all of about 5 minutes before Coco already had spinach on her lap, feeding her bits of the non-human safe sausages, while trying to keep the cat's paws and face out of her own food. Eventually, Nia and Tuya also joined up with them, coming down the stairs already dressed, prepped and ready for the day. At some point, one of them had the bright idea to test out if the Earth cats would also enjoy the brew meant for the space cat. It turned out that they did, but only in moderation. Of course, it also didn't take long before each of the humans had tried at least one sip of the broth, despite James's well-meant warnings. Results were a bit less apprehensive there, and the information that, yes, there was indeed hair in the sausages, kept them from trying out any more after that. When everyone slowly started to fill up on food, the shenanigans began to slow down as well, and the conversation took a more casual turn. "So, what does everyone plan for the day?" Coco was the first to ask, by now already towards the end of her second helping of coffee. "I'm deciding around when I should head home. Anything fun planned it's worth sticking around for?" "I don't know. Sleep?" Sheeta offered as her answer, slumping down onto the table now that her stomach was filled. And it was obvious that she had still been woken up way before her preferred time, even despite James's attempts at accommodation. James wanted to give a tour of the compound as well, and he said something about a sauna or something. "Sauna? All right, count me in," Coco announced, her question having thus apparently been answered. "A tour sounds good, although I can also get one any time, so..." Tuya replied, ending the sentence with a shrug of her shoulders, instead of actually thinking of a way to end it. James also shrugged. He didn't exactly mind when he would give the tour, which was apparently a good thing because Flynn began to kind of awkwardly shuffle around in his seat. "Yeah, maybe leave the tour for another time," he chimed in, pulling everyone's eyes onto him as he put his hand onto the table. "Today might not be the best day. I already got these kids coming over, kinda big names. Well, I doubt any of you will have heard of them. The Tshirt and Alkfador, they call themselves. Don't ask me what it means. Anyway, they'll be here to get a tour and film some stuff for their series. Content for them and a bit of free advertisement for me and all that. But I wager that you might not exactly want to be on video at the moment, given the situation, so yeah. Don't want them getting extra footage of one of Earth's rare visitors. As they looked back at him, nobody seemed especially broken up about it. If they had the tour today or tomorrow really didn't seem to matter to any of their guests, so they just shrugged it off and decided to have it some other time. However, James got something else out of what his uncle had just said, and he crossed his arms on the table as he worriedly looked over. "Wait, you're having a tour today?" he asked his uncle, in a mixture of worry and slight disbelief. Flynn swayed his head from side to side as he replied, "Yeah, I'm sorry and all, but it was booked ages ago. If I had known any of this was going to happen, I obviously wouldn't have taken it. But I can't exactly tell them no for no good reason now. If you just go out for a day or stay in the house, I'm sure you'll be..." James lifted his hand, interrupting Flynn in his explanation. "No, that's not what I meant," he said firmly, and tried to make eye contact with Flynn. "Of course you're still going to have tours while we're here. What I mean is, today? And they're even going to film it?" There seemed to be a bit of diversion between their trains of thought, because for a moment, the two men just stared, one as confused as the other. "Yeah?" Flynn more asked than replied after a few seconds, and James snapped out of his stupor with an energetic push. "Flynn, you still have Christmas decorations lying around everywhere," he said, trying his very best so it wouldn't sound like an accusation, which it definitely wasn't. He really was just worried. "Donations are piling up at the entrance. You have the tractor gathering snow behind the house, and you want to have people around filming the premises today?" Flynn cleared his throat and broke off their eye contact for a moment, as he hesitantly glanced around the room, seemingly thinking of a reply. With the light shining on his ever-greying hair, he looked especially old at that moment. "Well, the tractor's broken," he mumbled, which on the one hand answered only one of the questions, and on the other brought up an entirely new one. "The tractor's broken? What's wrong with it?" Nia now asked in James's stead, her eyes turning towards the direction of the windows that would have given her a view of the heavy machinery in the backyard. Flynn shook his head. "No idea," he replied, seemingly glad to have a relatively simple question to answer. "Guy from the workshop didn't have time to come out and look at it yet. I opened it up, but I couldn't find anything." Well, obviously. James kept his mouth shut on the topic. However, when it came to mechanical repairing skills, his uncle was only very slightly above his own skill level, which meant nothing more than that Flynn didn't actively break something whenever he tried to fix it. Nia furrowed her brow. "Well, why didn't you say something?" she asked again, and put down her fork so she also had her hands free as they talked. Then, she swept a loose braid out of her face as she continued. "I could have taken a look at it. I fixed the thing more times than I can count. I'll do it right after dinner." She quickly gave Tuya an inquisitive look, probably to probe if her new special guest had any problems with her doing some repairs for a bit, while she was around. Tuya, however, was completely on board. "Same here. Back home I used to fix farm stuff. Now I fix military stuff. Honestly, it's not all that different these days," she explained with an enthusiastic movement of her arms. "I mean, I can't promise anything depending on what broke, but there's a whole host of problems that can be mended with just a bit of work." Flynn's body moved into an almost defensive position as he straightened himself up, seemingly ready to reply something, and most likely deny the offer of help, fruitless as it may be. However, James already wasn't having it with his beloved uncle, and he simply stated, "And since I'll be no help there, I'll run around and make sure everything looks organized. Gather the decorations, sort whatever donations I can carry without the tractor into place, maybe clear some of the waste from snow. Whatever I can find," he mused, reaching his hand over to glide along the hair of his girlfriend, who was still lying slouched over the table. "Hell, I haven't had my morning workout yet, so that'll be a nice substitute. And I can take the dog for a run in the process as well. Meanwhile, Sheeta can go catch up on some sleep." Sheeta made an approving humming noise that almost sounded like she had been afraid that she, too, would get roped into helping in cleaning up the place. But no, working out in the uninhabitable climate for a longer time wasn't exactly something he wanted to put her through on her vacation. Flynn groaned slightly, still sounding uneasy about it all. "Kids, really, I got this," he said with his hands raised, but James simply leaned back. "Who cares?" he asked. "Not like I ever needed a reason to help around here. It comes with the family." He got a general nod of agreement from all around him, with the exception of Sheeda, who simply raised a lazy thumbs up, agreeing with the plan. Flynn looked at all of them for a moment, his mouth quietly moving as if it was trying to somehow form a reasonable way to decline that just wasn't there. What was he going to do, after all? Fire them so they wouldn't pick things up? Call the cops on them? Even if he really didn't want their help, which James somehow doubted, he didn't exactly have a choice. Although he did have to wonder why his uncle had such a hard time just saying, "Sure, all right," he finally mumbled. "There's no arguing with you. Just don't come yapping to me when your vacation is suddenly over and all you did was work." James just huffed at that. As if that even counted as work anymore.